So those who know me in person know that I'm a very reserved person when it comes to my personal life, except when it comes to talking about my cats. But today I wanted to share with you something that very few people know, but I think it's very important for us Latinos to start talking about this and start sharing these stories. So here's my story. What's up guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is America, and for today's video I'm gonna do something a little different. So it took me a while to finally decide to share this with people, to make this public, because it's a chapter in my life that it was so hard for me to deal with and that I've decided to leave behind. However, I've realized that probably not the only one who has experienced this, and I want people who are currently experiencing that to know that they're not alone and that this is a real thing that people need to start talking about. At the beginning of this year, I made one of the hardest decisions that I've made in my life. I quit my clinical psychology PhD program after experiencing racial microaggressions for 4 years. Just to give you a little background, I was pursuing my PhD degree in clinical psychology since 2016 up until this year. Now these type of programs are very competitive and really hard to get into. They typically only accept between 5 to 8 students per year, so you have to be a really outstanding student to get into these programs. And I was one of those students because I worked really hard throughout my undergraduate degrees to be able to get into a PhD program of this kind. So I graduated from college, majoring in psychology and criminology, and graduated with the highest honors. I was selected as the best student in both of my careers, so in criminology and as well as psychology, and I was selected as one of 5 students in my whole college who had the highest GPA. So as you can see, I was pretty high achieving. And I'm not sharing all of this to show off, but I think it's very important for you guys to have this in mind as I share my story so you can understand what I was going through. So as I just explained, I was pretty much a very high achieving student, which I thought was the only thing that I needed to be able to succeed in grad school. However, I am also Latina, which I didn't think would matter until I got to this program. So in 2016, I got accepted into a PhD program. I was one of 8 students that year who got accepted into this specific program at this specific university. The other 7 students were all females and were all white, coming from middle to high class families. So at that time, and until my 2nd to 3rd year being in that program, I was the only Latina in that whole program. And I was probably one of only about 5 minority students that had been accepted to the program. During my 2nd semester of my 1st year is when I started experiencing differential treatment or behavioral microaggressions by my professors in that program, which continued up until my 4th year. So if you're not familiar with what microaggressions are, they are very subtle forms of discrimination that can be either verbal or behavioral, and that can happen casually, very frequently, and often without any intent to harm. In other words, they are comments or behaviors that are influenced by unconscious bias. In my case, it seemed to be racial bias. I'm gonna explain how that happened. So some research actually suggests that microaggressions are even more harmful to the individual that direct racism or discrimination, for the reason that because they're so subtle, it's really hard to determine in that moment whether what was said or how or whether that certain behavior was due to racial bias. So how that becomes even more harmful than direct racism is that the individual has to spend so much more time processing that, in trying to explain not only what had happened but also why that happened. It actually drains the victims mentally to the point that it often leads to mental health problems such as anxiety and depression. So in my case, majority of these experiences involve being called out in front of my peers for using my computer, or being asked in front of my peers what I was doing on my computer when everyone else was using their computer, but my professors for some reason only noticed me or only paid attention to me and did not give me the benefit of the doubt as to what I was doing. And for some reason their first assumption was always negative about me. It also included instances where professors didn't believe that I was the one who wrote a good paper, because that's the way they framed it as. It was such a good paper and they were questioning whether I wrote that paper or not, and to the point of asking me to give them my previous drafts for them to be sure that I wrote that paper. And it also included instances where I was questioned more than my students and asked to justify every single thing every single decision that I made as a clinical psychologist, so as a therapist, whereas my peers, who were all white, were never questioned the same way that I was questioned. For example, my first year, my second semester, I was taking a class, and in this class, again, it was with my other 7 peers who got accepted the same year as me. All of them, again, were white students. And now at least half of those students arrived to that class late every single time that we had to take that class. And the professor didn't seem to be bothered by it. And I honestly didn't even pay attention to that, since, you see that in college all the time. However, there was this one time when I had a medical condition that I had to make an appointment for. And I was only able to make that appointment during that class period. Now, it wasn't that I would miss the class, it was just that I would have to leave the class 10 to 15 minutes early so that I could make it to my doctor's appointment. As a responsible student that I was, I emailed the professor ahead of time to let him know that I had this medical, pretty much emergency that I had to go see a doctor for, and I asked him for permission to leave the class early. He responded pretty quickly and was okay with me leaving class early, and gave me his permission and didn't say anything else. So the day came and I entered the classroom, and the professor, the first thing that he did when he saw me was to call me out in front of class, in front of my peers, and told me that I shouldn't be making doctor's appointments during his class period. Now, at that time, I felt bad about it, but I was also very confused as to why he waited that long to demonstrate that he wasn't okay with me doing that, when I had already emailed him about it. And the other confusion was that why was it not okay for me to leave class early, but it was okay for my peers to arrive to class super late. So even though mine was justified, it was still for some reason not okay for me to do that, but it was okay for my peers. So I spent so much time that second semester just analyzing that situation and wondering why that had happened to me, because I've never experienced that before, because I was always a very responsible, high achieving student. So as you can see, in this situation, it wasn't any direct racism. It wasn't obvious discrimination, but it does leave you wondering why I was being singled out. So the next year, I was taking another class with a different professor, and again, I was called out in front of my peers, and I was being asked what I was doing on my computer. So now there were at least 6 other students in that class, again, all of them which were white, and I was the only Latino. All of my peers were using their computers as well in class, because that's what you do in college. And yet, for some reason, that professor was only wondering what I was doing on my computer, to the point of calling me out in front of everyone to ask me what I was doing on my computer. And again, this wasn't direct racism or discrimination, but it was even more confusing after that class period ended, that my peers went up to me because they were shocked. They were asking me why that professor had singled me out if everyone was using their computers. So I wasn't the only one noticing those things, but them probably didn't think twice about it. Whereas for me, I spent so much time again trying to analyze that situation, trying to think why professors keep thinking or having negative assumptions about me. And actually my peers had told me that that was the first time in their whole time in that program, and they were more advanced than me, that they had seen that happen. I spent a lot of time and mental energy just trying to come up with an answer as to why, even though all my peers use their computers, that professor was only paying attention to me with the assumption that I was doing something wrong on my computer. It was automatically I was doing something wrong. So even though my peers got the benefit of the doubt, I didn't for some reason. In my third year, I had a professor question whether I had written a paper, and to me at first, I thought this was routine or something. But that professor before had criticized one of my papers. This time she made a clear statement that this was a really good paper, and that I guess she didn't think that I wrote it, and she asked me to give her previous drafts of that paper to make sure how much I had written. So at that point I was already noticing a pattern in this program. I was already feeling that I was being singled out by not one professor but by many professors. Again, it wasn't that it was direct racism or discrimination. I wasn't even sure that it was due to race. But instance after instance, the only difference between me and my peers was that they were white and I was Latino. I was an ethnic minority, because there wasn't a lot of ethnic minorities in my classes or in the whole program. At that point I was already noticing a pattern, and I pointed that out to that professor, who is also the director of that program, who is also the professor in charge of training us to be culturally competent and to appreciate diversity, because that's one of the main key elements that you need as a clinical psychologist. Actually, that professor denied everything that I had experienced. She told me that I just didn't take feedback well. That same year, I was in a clinical meeting. The director of our psychology clinic came into the meeting to ask all the students to make sure that the clinical hours that she had in her system were accurate. So she asked us to double check on our own records of our hours. So all my peers, when it was their turn, they took their phones out, they took their computers out, and my clinical supervisor didn't seem to be bothered by that because we were being asked to do that. However, when it came to my turn and I opened my computer to do that, she asked me in front of everyone to do that after the meeting. She didn't want me to be using my computer in supervision. At that point, I had enough of that. I had spent hours, days, months trying to analyze those situations, trying to figure out what was wrong with me, or why my professors thought that there was something wrong with me, that I was, for some reason, I'm not capable of writing good papers. I shouldn't be using my computer because I'm only going to use it for things not related to classes. I felt the need to have my resume in my face or something, or have it with me just so that they wouldn't get to know me, so that the first thing they saw wasn't this Latino face, that they would see me at the same way that they saw my peers. And that's when I realized that the first thing they saw when they saw me was my ethnic background, and that for some reason that's what was probably influencing their behaviors towards me, and their actions and their thoughts, and even when they didn't realize it, because that's what microaggressions are. It's just actions, it's comments, our thoughts, beliefs, assumptions, that even though most of the time they're not aware of it, they're influenced by racial bias or things that they've heard, stereotypes that they've heard before and that they believe deep down. So on my third year, I had the opportunity to actually speak out about what was happening, with the intention to improve this program, to get more resources for ethnic minority students. So there was this one time where the American Psychological Association came to review the program. The APA is the main association in charge of reviewing these type of programs to ensure that we're following their guidelines, because they have very strict guidelines One of them being, again, cultural competence or diversity. And so what they do is every certain years they come to each program to review it. The way they do that is that they speak to the professors, and they also provide a safe space for students to share their experiences, to share any suggestions for improvement. But what they do is that they schedule a meeting with each cohort where it's only one representative and then the students of that year, without the professors, without the program director, because it's supposed to provide a safe space for us to talk, to not be afraid that professors might know what we say and then retaliate against us. My peers share their experiences in the program. They share very negative things about the program, and everyone just listened to them and respected their opinions. However, when it came to my turn, all I said was that I wish there was more diversity in this program and I wish there was more help for ethnic minorities. The representative asked me to tell her more, and at that point I was honest and I shared how I felt that I've been treated differently than my peers. In that meeting, only 2 of my peers knew about these experiences. The other 5 didn't and had never even witnessed it or noticed it when it happened. I had the privilege to never have to worry about these things or even learn about these things. So despite that, they were quick to deny what I had experienced in front of that representative, to tell her that whatever she experienced is not what had happened. She's just not interpreting the situations correctly. Our professors are not racist. Racism doesn't exist here. They invalidated my experiences, even though they have respected my peers' experiences. However, they didn't think that of me. They didn't think that I deserved the right to experience or have my own experiences. I came out of that meeting crying. I couldn't believe would invalidate my experiences, even when they didn't even know about them. But yeah, they knew that they were not true. Even though that meeting was supposed to be confidential because it was supposed to be a safe space provided by the APA for students to share their experiences, because we have a right to. Didn't think I had a right to share my experiences. They didn't think I had a right to confidentiality. So they went up to the director to tell her everything I had said. Of course, they didn't mention that they had also shared negative things. They just said that I had shared those things. So in their eyes, in their minds, it was better to invalidate my experiences than for them to be affected. Or even if the program did need improvement, they didn't care. All they cared about was them. And the worst thing was that the director, of course, so grateful that they had told her that, because that way she could prepare when the APA representative would talk to her. After that, my peers stopped talking to me for at least 1 semester. And not only that, but they went up to every other student in that program and told them what I had said, and told them that I had put the program at risk for lying about being treated differently. Racism doesn't exist anymore. So at that point, I wanted to quit the program because I could not deal with all of this injustice. So not only was I experiencing racial microaggressions by professors, but I was also being isolated and bullied by my peers for being different and for talking about racial bias, because there were people who don't want to hear about that. So I met several times with the program director, who had again thanked my peers for what they had done. I begged her many times to do something, to say something to them, because to me, and I think for anyone, that was so unethical for them to have done that, to have violated my confidentiality, lacked empathy. They lacked cultural competence, which are one of the main elements of becoming being trained as a clinical psychologist, is to have these skills or attributes. So even though I had decided to quit that program after that, I decided to stay and suck it up, because many people told me I was so close to getting my PhD. So I did that. However, I was diagnosed with clinical depression after everything that I went through, and I had to go to therapy and be on medication for at least 1 year after that, be able to heal from that and be able to feel confident about myself again. Because after that, I had to take classes with those peers, I had to take classes with those professors, and for the next year I had so much anxiety that I couldn't even take my computer out to use it. I had to start writing things by hand, even though my peers had the privilege to take their computers out and use them. I didn't. Even though I sucked it up for 1 more year, I was so unhappy to be there. I didn't feel like I fit in that program because everyone seemed to have, these values of selfish and of invalidating people's experiences and of not being culturally competent or having empathy for others, which is what that profession is about, because clinical psychologists are supposed to be the professionals with the most empathy, with the most cultural competence, the ones with the most sense of confidentiality, and that's not what I was seeing. That's not what they showed ever. So they were showing the opposite, and they were training those students, my peers, to be that like them. So at the beginning of this year in 2020, I finally realized that what mattered to me most was my mental health. I had already healed from clinical depression. I was out of therapy already. I had already dealt with that enough, but I just couldn't be part of a program that didn't share my values. Seeing how they don't care how racially biased the students are, and I had to be the one constantly calling those students out, correcting their stereotypes, and yet my professors thought those students were good clinicians. Like, how are they letting those students go on to the world to provide services to ethnic minorities, knowing how they really think? At the beginning of this year, I realized all those things. I finally realized that, it didn't matter that I was so close to getting my PhD if I was so unhappy, if I was gonna be so unhappy for the next 2 years to be just in that program. I decided that the best thing for me was to quit. And I say quit because to me that's not quitting. While that was the most difficult decision that I've made so far, it was also the best decision that I've made, because I'm so happy right now that I'm out of that program. Still can't believe that there are programs like that students of color, especially Latinos, have to go through this. I think that it's time for us to start talking about these things, to start sharing our experiences, because there are many other students out there who are in a similar position as I was, and I just want them to know that they're not alone, that this is a real thing, that their experiences are valid despite what everyone else says. Do not be afraid to quit a program or to leave a job, because we should always choose our mental health first. I want people to start recognizing these things, to know that microaggressions are a real thing, and also for those people who are privileged enough to not have to worry about these things, to know that just because you haven't experienced it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It doesn't mean that it's not a thing, that us Latinos or just ethnic minorities in general are more likely to be able to recognize these things because we have prior experience than white people. And if you know anyone who might be experiencing something similar, share this video or share what you know, or do more research on microaggressions, because there's a lot of research done on them and a lot of research on how that leads to mental illness. So let them know that they're not alone, and please validate their experiences, because invalidating experiences does so much harm to someone. So thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.